All right. Hey, everybody. I hope everyone's having a good night. I'm going to give it a couple more minutes and allow some folks to drift in. We had a pretty lengthy registration list, so I'd like to get as many folks in as possible before we get started. All right, I'm going to get us started tonight, and I'll just continue to admit people who filter in. All right, so thank you so much for spending your Wednesday evening learning about prescribed burning with the Yuba Bear Burn Cooperative. It's a beautiful evening, and so I'm flattered that you decided to spend it with us. My name's Cordy Craig. I recently transitioned into the YBBC coordinator position. My predecessor, Jamie Irvin, who many of you have met and burned with over the last couple of years, spearheaded this speaker series and built a lot of community momentum. And so I wanted to thank him for organizing such a great lineup of folks tonight and over the next several months. I'm excited to see a lot of familiar names on this registration list, and I'm looking forward to meeting those I haven't met yet. So I'd also like to give a shout out to the organization that employs me and helped fund this great speaker series and other upcoming events for YBBC. So the Sierra Forest Legacy is a nonprofit organization working to conserve and protect forest ecosystems in the Sierra Nevada bioregion. We work to restore beneficial fire to improve ecosystem resilience and conserve biodiversity. We apply the best practices of science, advocacy, and grassroots engagement through coalition building to improve conditions for people and nature. So the Yuba Bear Burn Cooperative is funded in part by a grant to Sierra Forest Legacy from the California Fire Safe Council's 2020 SFA grant program. The California Fire Safe Council and related publications are funded in full by the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Southwest region. The opinions expressed in this speaker series are those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Forest Service. So let's do a little housekeeping before I introduce our speaker for tonight. Many of us are familiar with Zoom events at this point, but I'm going to ask that everybody remains on mute until the end when we'll have time for questions. Also, although I'd love to see all your gorgeous faces, I'm also going to ask that we keep our videos off once the speaker begins, just to reduce any bandwidth issues. We'll reserve some time for questions at the end, but you're also welcome to throw them in the chat box and I can help facilitate them later. This meeting will be recorded, so for those of you who cannot join us or want a second viewing, I will make that available. So without further ado, I'll introduce Josh Davy. Josh has worked as a cooperative extension livestock and range advisor and researcher for 18 years. He's published numerous peer-reviewed research articles on cattle, rangeland, fire, and weed management. He's board certified through the American College of Animal Science, is a certified range manager through the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, and a certified professional animal scientist specializing in beef cattle. So his graduate degrees are in animal biology from the University of California, Davis. And he has a bachelor's in agricultural business and 2 minors in animal science and business administration from CSU Chico. So with that, Josh, I'm actually going to hand the mic over to you. You can share your screen, but let me know if you have any issues and I can help you out.
Great, thank you. I'm assuming you can hear me okay?
All good.
Good. So I will share the screen and we'll see if it comes up. Uh-oh, it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, that's my fault. Try now.
Looks like we're working. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, let me know. I'm happy to go through it. The first slide says medusahead, but I thought what I would do, to me, it seems like there's value in figuring out, say, if we're doing prescribed burns, which a lot of popularity in the foothill region is for weed control, to cover kind of what we know research-wise on the big 3, so medusahead, barbed goatgrass, and yellow starthistle, and cover their timings, maybe go through and explain what they are and why they're bad, and what we can potentially do about them. Using fire as a potential tool. So starting with the first one, medusahead, there's a photo that can kind of give you a pretty good idea of it. Probably our most common range weed that we have on rangelands in Northern California foothills. And essentially this is the problem. You can see from this slide, it's a photo I took down off Highway 20 at the Payne Ranch on some medusahead work I was doing. It forms a solid mat monoculture that essentially chokes everything else out, and the high silica content of it makes it unpalatable to livestock and also slow to break down. So its competitive advantage is that it builds that thatch and has the ability to shoot 2 radicals out of the seed, which allows it to have the best chance of germinating a thatch. If the first one doesn't work, it'll throw another one that potentially will. So factors that bring its invasion on, that thatch. We did find that no harvesting the grass or grazing for 10 years can shift it even further beyond medusahead, but generally a major factor that encourages it is its competitive ability once it builds that thatch, and you can see the amount of seed it's dropping on the ground there compared to anything else pictured. It does like better soils. In this area, generally prefers the clay soil. So as you get into the shallower ground, oftentimes you'll see less of it. Seed dispersal is often through our vehicles. There are some studies that show catching the hides of livestock and easily dispersed from that. But to get to the crux of it, what do we do about this guy with fire? This is actually a medusahead control burn that I did in some research trials west of Red Bluff. And so what did we figure out? And I'm going to try to do this presentation by just giving you the summaries of research. So my goal is to not put a single p-value in here so that it can be a little more user-friendly in terms of just getting to the bare bones of it. So the big key with burning medusahead is that it has to be, of course, dry enough to carry the fire, but you don't want the seeds to drop to the soil surface. Generally, the seeds on the soil surface in a grass fire are pretty safe. Obviously, a brush fire is a lot hotter, so that makes quite a bit of a difference. But having the seed up in the stalk lets it burn all the way up to the seed and essentially take it out. So in our case, this is usually June when it's when the seeds are in there. They're not fully viable, but they're getting close, but there's enough thatch to be able to actually carry the fire. The nice part about fire with medusa head is exactly this. Most of the seeds germinate rapidly in the fall, which means that anything you do, whether it's a single one-time herbicide application or grazing control, or in this case, a fire, can put a huge reduction of medusa head in just that, with just that single action. And this is an example. If you look at the blue line, we had a site where we went where pre-burn in 2011, it was close to 80% of the cover of forage that was on the rangeland site that we burned. The following year, it was just over 0. So in one single year, we made a huge knock in it. The red line, just for reference, the big drop of that is, of course, that was the year we had the big drought. So we actually had control levels drop down as well after that, showing that even a single year of drought can actually hugely limit medusa head's ability because it is so late to mature. So what do you do? And that's one of the things I look at from the last slide, and you'll notice the control levels can be the same. And in a relatively short amount of time is what the treated area was, because it is so easy to reinvade. I mean, you look at the dog in that picture and how many medusa head seeds can he pack. But this is two options I look at for revegetation. Look at both a perennial and an annual introduction. And I've had some different trials and published some different things on perennial plantings. And if soils are deep enough and you're in a rainfall area where there is enough moisture to be able to make it work, harding grass and Berber orchard grass are traditional perennials that have been added to rangelands throughout with variable success. But a new one that we've come up with in the last 10 years is fletcha fescue. It's actually a summer dormant tall fescue. That's what the picture is that you see there. The full row going down here is fletcha. This is also the established stand tent, looking at it straight off. I find it to be a little hardier than the other two. It's not just drought hardier, but actually more grazing tolerant as well, and fairly fine leaf, so it's still palatable, unlike some of the irrigated pasture tall fescues. That's not without, I never want to promise a perfect plant, so just thinking about what steps you'd have to do. You'd have great weed control with a controlled burn in the spring prior to the fall of seeding, but the burn would take care of that for you. What you would likely want to do is retreat with a non-selective herbicide such as glyphosate in the fall, so that you can take out germinating filiary plants that will not be controlled, and then again follow that with a 2,4-D application in the spring. And grazing deferral from the fall of planting is probably about 1.5 years. So probably your biggest cost in this is that ground goes out of production. So it's important to keep in mind that skipping a step of this can equal total failure. I have rarely had years where I get lucky enough to be able to skip one of these and have enough rain for it to be able to work. So following those is important. And if it's not possible, it's probably not the best option. You might be better off looking at something that, although maybe shorter term control, would be looking at planting an annual, like annual ryegrass. Is pretty cheap. Berber orchard grass is not Berber orchard grass, sorry, Blondo brome shown there is quite a bit more expensive, but with cost share options through NRCS and that, it may become more attainable, where you're looking at $5 plus a pound compared to cents a pound for the annual ryegrass. But the advantage with these is you can fly them on before rain. They're pretty easy to get established. Almost always have success. Downside is they may not last more than several years as a dominant species in the mix without reintroduction. So there's definitely trade-offs of both. So that's the ending result of that burn that was very successful in June for medusa head control. But again, you can see how far we had that actually dried down before it burned. But I think waiting any later than June would have affected us a lot in how successful we are. So this, the next one moving on is barbed goatgrass, and you can see it on the left, and it's really easy for people to mistake it, because oftentimes you just see something that's kind of green late in the season and assume that it's medusahead, which is also pictured here, because it is a late maturer like medusahead. Only I would be out scouting, because this guy is even worse. It probably makes medusahead look like a blessing. Barbed goatgrass is the most common one, but I do see a lot of jointed goatgrass around. And for all intents and purposes, in terms of controlled burning, you can assume that they are ubiquitous or similar. Barbed goatgrass will germinate throughout the season. That is actually a big disadvantage, because you cannot control it just by doing a weed control method in the fall. It limits you, that you are stuck with any real control method doing it in the spring. Fortunately, that falls right in with the controlled burning. It matures much later. I said medusahead matures later. Barbed goatgrass matures much later than even medusahead. So if you look at it and you see this young tuft of grass here, and it looks like it should be palatable, and you wonder what's wrong with it. And I think this photo pretty well sums it up. With those spikes and those on, you can see why livestock don't like it. It's not even fun to walk through, crawling down your socks and everything else. So that photo is pretty self-explanatory why barbed goatgrass is bad. When I said matures later than most anything else, you can see a patch of barbed goatgrass there that I took May 30th, and notice that it's how green it still is compared to everything else. The oats and everything there have already dropped all their seed. So a really late maturer on rangelands. That's an up close picture. Again, look at how dry everything else. We've got seed that's shattered already here, and this seed is actually not even viable yet. You could still control that plant with a herbicide and actually keep it from producing seed. So the biggest problem with this guy that differentiates it is in actually the spikelet that it has. If you look, it's got joints here. There's one, there's one, there's one, and there's one. In the fall, when this thing's fully mature, around September, that spikelet will fall off of the stalk and break into these 4 different segments. So these bottom 2 have 2 seeds, and the top 2 only have 1 seed. The problem with the 2 seeds is it gives it a 2-year chance. So within that 2 seeds that I mentioned inside that, there's 1 larger seed and 1 smaller seed. So the larger seed will germinate the following fall. So if you burn it this year, you've controlled that larger seed. The problem is that smaller seed is still sitting on the ground from last year and ready to germinate the year following a burn. So any control method that we do will absolutely require 2 years of control, and in fact won't even make a dent in the plant population or cover that you see. So to kind of give you an idea, if you're looking at it in the fall, that's in my left hand here, that's the spikelet that actually fell off, as compared to medusahead, where you can see it's still all attached and the seed just drops out. In fact, if you pull a plant out of the ground and look at it, through most of the entire season, this part right here, that joint will remain intact. So if you're ever wondering about identification in the fall after it's germinated, besides looking at these dry plants, you'll always find that joint still attached to the root. This gives you an idea of what it looks like. It actually reminds you of a wheat field, which is ironic that it is a relative of wheat, but that spikelet has fallen off of this stalk. So you'll just see a bunch of stalks of that looks like it's been harvested out in the fall. But if you reach down into the duff, you'll find those spikelets down there. So what about a controlled burn? This was a controlled burn that we did west of Red Bluff on it. So in thinking about the timing, and I reached back to June, it's a really similar timing to what works for medusahead. Again, this is a shot of it in May. Much better control of by burning it later in terms of being able to carry the fire in what you would see in this photo in June. And that's usually fairly repeatable. I mean, we may have weird years like last year where things mature early or something, but you can almost this far north count on the right timing being June. But to recap, this guy's going to take 2 full years to control it. And I'll get into some options that you might have for follow-up. But this is something I bring up just because the first year I saw this with a controlled burn, I was pretty concerned. You can see all the spikelets on the ground. This is after the fire's actually already burned through. And you can pull those up and actually pull seeds out of them. So one of the things I did was, you see the burned area here versus a solid goat grass area spanning through here. I ran transects actually through burned versus unburned on each side to see if we had controlled future seed production. And you can see through here, these are all spikelets. So pretty heavy load of spikelets all through those. But the results were very promising. In the burned area, I actually had a 0% germination from those spikelets that were again laying on the ground, where I had a 60% germination from that which hadn't been burned. So it is a very good, fire is a very good tool for being able to prevent seed production in the future. So how do you follow it? The difficult part that we've run into is research at Hopland showed 2 years of controlled burn worked very well. The hard part is up here is not Hopland. We don't grow the amount of forage. So I've run into the problem where we can't get enough fuel the second year to actually carry a fire, especially with how drought prone we've been in the last 10 years. So other options may be required. Luckily, I have some newer research that shows pretty low rates of non-selective herbicides like glyphosate work really well. Again, remember that they would have to happen in the spring because those plants will germinate all through the season. I have run into that train wreck where I've tried to do a follow-up in the fall after I thought we had a good germination, but was not successful because I did have so much germination afterward. Glyphosate is the most popular for this because it has a range registration in grazed areas. Clethodim also works very well, but it only has a registration for non-ag areas. So if you have different scenarios, you might run it by your ag commissioner to see what you can do, particularly if you have concerns about wildflowers or something like that. Clethodim is only going to target the grass species. So you might, if you have goals of preserving forbs that the fire would have created, that might be an option for you, and maybe have to consider a grazing deferral or something, but that can be all settled with a sit down with the ag commissioner. And then again, might be worth looking at doing some reseeding. Mowing has been shown to kind of work, but it's a difficult process in rangeland settings because you can start an accidental fire just as easy as a prescribed fire with the rocks, and then you run into the problem of you have plants that have fallen over or low growing plants that germinated late, and unfortunately missing one plant through a process like that can mean reinfestation. So if you do mow, this is the perfect time. We published some work where we looked at how late can you go for differing things. And if you notice from this photo, the stalk is brown, so the plant is starting to wilt, but up here, the spikelet is still green. Mowing, herbicide applications, and that will work at that timing. The key cutoff when you're too late for those kinds of applications is when this starts to turn red. That is the point where it's too late. I've done quite a few different projects looking at grazing. I've had a lot of luck in different grazing treatments with medusahead, which is what is in this photo. I have not had luck on projects using grazing as a treatment with barbed or jointed goat grass. I've been able to condense them, but that second seed and the amount of plants that get away are just brutal for having control. So it's one weed where I tend to say we just got to throw the whole wash tub at it and control every plant we can so that we can try to get it out. Because the advantage of having large, wide-scale control is that it doesn't spread as rapidly, or doesn't tend to spread as rapidly as some of the others. The patches start out as small circles and then move out from there. So if you can have a large-scale control on a larger area, on a big acreage that may be infested, follow-up control in the future to stop plants from spreading can be much easier. You'd be looking at backpack sprayers rather than having to do full-scale treatments of hundreds of acres. But the burn is a great way to get it started because that's a pretty guaranteed method and can help spark germination in the future. So the last of our big three is yellow star thistle. And just like barbed goat grass, yellow star thistle can germinate throughout the season, including fall, winter, or spring. So you look at a year like this, we would obviously have germination already from the wet fall that we had. But even with this break in midwinter, if we end up with March rains, we can have, we'll still have more germination of star thistle through the season. So here's an example. It's a pretty unnoticeable plant when it's young. This, I think, is pretty recognizable as it goes through the season in terms of being able to identify it. Cattle relish it at this stage through the bolting period. But the part that I see that is pretty interesting in how this plant works is it essentially has a competitive advantage of creating a miniature drought. So the plants that germinated, and this year may be a perfect example for you to be able to take a look if you've got star thistle sites, the plants that germinate early, they're the ones that take up the deep moisture because right now they are building roots that go as far down as the soil profile will allow. And the later germinating plants that we may have in March, they'll take up the shallow moisture. So essentially, they are pulling all the moisture they can out. So you'll hear a lot of people say that you can water out yellow star thistle. And it's somewhat true, but somewhat not. And the reason that it's somewhat true is that this plant has a competitive advantage of eliminating competition by making that miniature drought. If you add water, such as you see on some people talking about it on, say, the edges of an irrigated pasture, you've taken away its competitive advantage. But at the same time, if you don't have anything else there to compete with it, it absolutely loves water and will just get that much bigger. A little side note with it too, one factor that we tend to think of late rains as being, say a May or June rain as being encouraging for star thistle. And that's true, it does help the plants particularly to go through and mature or get even bigger. But the biggest decision factor for a big star thistle year is March rains. So that's the timing that allows them to actually be able to finalize their nasty little plan to grow enough roots to choke everybody else out later in the season. So the late maturity, one of the things I usually do is my mouth waters when I see a lot of big star thistle plants because you know you have good soils to be able to do it because that's what they require. The plants produce an abundance of seed, over 100,000. But really, one of the things we can use with fire is to be able to do it is that we can create a situation where we make rapid germination. They often say that the seeds only last for several years in the soil, but it probably is because most of them germinate. You can see the little bristles in here. So if you're making fire breaks or something for a fire, watch running around through it. You may be spreading it because that's what these little guys are for, is grabbing and getting spread around. They don't tend to move like an Italian thistle or a bull thistle in the wind nearly as much, but they're really easy to pick up and move. So the interesting part of it is back to our June timing, which is kind of nice. What we found is we have our big 3 weeds and they all have timing of about mid-June for optimal burning time up here in the North State. I've always, before I almost had to do the research myself to be able to believe it, because you look at that timing in June and see these plants and how green they are. It makes it hard to believe that a grass fire would produce enough heat to get them, but it does work. And like the barbed goatgrass, it does, and medusahead, it does eliminate this year's seed. Again, you can see in that how green this was compared to everything else in the photo, but it was successful. The hard part is that a fall burn on a mature plant won't control that seed. And as we saw and that holds true with both goatgrass and medusahead as well. You still have this year's current seed production if you burn in the fall, because that seed would have shattered, hit the ground, and the fire just isn't hot enough to be able to do it. But in star thistle has its own little deal that fire is actually the best tool to be able to control it, because you may eliminate this year's seed production, but what about the seed bank that's already there? And the beauty part with a fire is that fire the first year is the only known tool that is full eradication of star thistle. And the reason is that following a controlled burn, it opens up the vegetation and sparks a seed bank of the entire seed bank. So what you have is the opportunity for the next season after the burn to control the entire seed bank. But if you don't, you may actually end up with worse star thistle than before you burned it. So the trick is we got to get rid of all of those seeds that will germinate the year after the fire, and then we'll have control. So back to the same idea, can you burn it again? And maybe it's tough up here. Maybe you have a good rain year afterward and you can get enough fuel to carry a fire. But I think you have to have a plan that what if you potentially can't? Because even though we got all these guys that are showing up here, there's still plenty more seed in seed bank from previous years. So mowing's an option, grazing's an option. I think the big trick with them is, again, back to the timing, back to the make sure we don't have plants escape, because then we just got the entire seed bank to germinate. The way we win and achieve eradication is by completely eliminating it. But it is doable as long as you don't mow too early. You would want to wait. If you're mowing, you could wait until those plants got up, started producing the actual spikes or the awns on the end. But prior to having enough bloom that they could go ahead and mature. Grazing kind of the same, except that you have to go a little bit earlier because you can't wait until the spikes come out if you want full consumption. And the other hard part with each of these is that if you have a wet spring, those plants have enough moisture to try to recover. So you may end up having to do, particularly with grazing, because you got to go a little earlier, repeated treatments throughout the spring to be able to do it. It's doable, but it's a little more difficult and time consuming than a potential another option, which could be a herbicide option. So post-emergent wise, we've got our regular 2,4-Ds, dicambas, triclopyr. I don't tend to use triclopyr for star thistle. As far as a post-emerge, I tend to go for 2,4-D. It's cheap. Well, not this year. Nothing's cheap this year, but it's generally cheap and very effective at thistles. If you get later and plants are getting closer to maturity, You might be better off to look at something like glyphosate. Tends to work a little faster than the growth regulators of like 2,4-D. And often with the timing being as late as it is, you don't generally have to worry about non-target species because it's about the only thing that's green. Some of the most popular options, which I would recommend, would be transliner milestone, so clopyrrolid or aminopyrrolid. Choosing between those two, I guess, just depends on which plant you're trying to target. Transline's cheaper than milestone, but you use a heavier rate, so I don't know that comes out as that much different. Probably the big thing was that if you were trying to not affect some plants like fillery, you'd probably go for transline. So a lot of guys grazing cattle would like the fillery, so you would go that option, as opposed to milestone, which at rates over 3 ounces will control fillery, but it does have the advantage of a little broader spectrum if you were wanting to control something like fiddleneck. If you were worried about a toxicity issue with fiddleneck, it covers that. Both are very successful in the control that they do. I often joke that I think you can drive by on the side of the road, wave the jug at them, and the starthistle will fall over dead. They work so well. The other advantage that they have is a pre-emergent ability. So they will control plants that have germinated, but if you spray them early in the season, you can control the entire season's worth of starthistle germination and provide an opportunity for other forages such as grasses to become established without having to compete with starthistle for moisture. So in that case, they are kind of the go-to option for starthistle through the year. I will make one caution. Those are non-restricted materials. You do have to have an operator ID, and they aren't. But they are because they bind to the soil so tight that they don't. That they generally don't pose a threat for runoff in that. But with that, I have one observation that I've made where I've done a starthistle application, and then I went back and I was going to plant something, and I harrowed over top of where I had sprayed, and never dawned on me until I saw starthistle popping up that what I'd done was disturb the soil, and that stuff binds so tight to the soil that when I disturbed it with a harrow, I essentially wiped out my the shield that I'd made on the soil that was protecting it from starthistle germination. So just something to think about in terms of follow-up. And then and that's what I had for formal. I thought I would open it up for questions. If there was questions on other stuff besides the big three, I think fire can be an excellent tool on all of these, particularly for a lot of situations where herbicides are not an option. Grazing in terms of fencing may be too expensive. And even if saving the expense of hiring an airplane to go out and apply a herbicide. So it can be a very economical tool if done at the right time, and the follow-up is completed to make sure that that full control is successful. So.
Thank you so much, Josh. That was awesome information, I think, for all of us. Amber, I see you had a question, and I think Josh touched on it a little bit, but maybe, Josh, can you speak more to invasives like Himalayan blackberry, Scotch broom, English ivy, and fire I know can be used to manage these invasives, but do you have any information as far as timing? Because that seemed to be the primary aspect regarding everything that you discussed with the invasives was timing was key.
Well, most of my experience with fire on those listed is with Himalaya blackberries, and obviously timing on them is pretty easy because dormancy in the winter makes it a lot easier to burn them. I don't obviously fire doesn't necessarily control a blackberry because their roots are so deep, but what it does is break down that thatch so that you can actually get into control them with, say, triclopyr or a combo of triclopyr and 2,4-D. So for that realm, I am a big fan of burn the site and then go back for follow-up control. One thing I do like to do in follow-up control is wait until later summer. You have to with Roundup if that's your choice for Himalaya blackberries, but I also don't mind doing it even with triclopyr or the combination of it, because it lets more leaf area sprout after the burn, which ups your chances of control. Sometimes the roots are so deep and so far that if you spray it directly, say in early summer, you may not have enough leaf area to take up the herbicide to actually control the immense roots that are under the ground.
Yeah, awesome. And Amber, I will say I only know a little bit about burning blackberry, but it burns really, really hot. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're prepping your site to burn. Take those extra precautions. I'm actually going to let other folks' voices into the room. Theo, if you want to ask your question, that'd be great. If not, no worries.
Hey, just to be a voice here. I was wondering if, like, how the pre-emergent works with the opuralids that you mentioned. Does it stop germination for just a season, or does it allow them to germinate and kill them quickly?
It'll stop germination for an entire growing season. So they actually, both Transline and Milestone, work so well that if you spray them in September, you'll have control all the way through spring for an entire growing season, but not the following year.
Thank you.
So yeah, one application is a season's worth of control.
And Josh, can you point us in any direction for additional resources on using fire for invasive species?
Well, I have quite a few articles in that I could do. I wonder what's the best way of summarizing that. I could put together something and send you a list of stuff that might be applicable to look at.
Yeah, that would be great. I was also thinking the timing aspect that kept coming up, I thought would be interesting. Do you have anything that's more organized as a calendar on follow-ups and treatments that you could share with us?
Sure. Well, for medusahead and yellow starthistle, there's actually the medusahead management guide that you can Google. It's through the Weed Research and Information Center, and it'll spell that out explicitly. Jody Tomaso and Guy Kaiser and I put quite a bit of work in drafting that. The other one is actually this through the same source. It's a yellow starthistle management guide, actually through the UC Weed Research and Information Center as well. Barbed goatgrass, in terms of burning, probably the staple publication is one that Jody Tomaso did in Hopland with that's in California Agriculture Journal. So I think if you Googled California Agriculture Journal and burning barbed goatgrass, that would come up. But with the other two, if you did Yellow Star Thistle Management Guide or Medusahead Management Guide, they would come up.
I have a question.
Sure.
Is that late June burning? Is CAL FIRE, I mean, in our area in Nevada County, that's really high fire, season already. And I don't know how cooperative they are with burns at that time.
I've actually never done without them.
You what?
I've actually never done a burn without them. So in the process, if you were doing it yourself in the process, you would actually have to check off the burn plan with them and have them out and look at the site. If you do a part of the vegetation management program, the VMP, they'll actually manage the burn. So that's nice because it takes a little bit of process and prep work ahead of time, but they also assume responsibility for liability, which is what you're worried about with the VMP program. The downside with it is, like you said, that's prime fire season. So if something happens and they got to go, you're on the back burner compared to an emergency fire somewhere else.
What are you saying, DMT program?
VMP, it's CAL FIRE's Vegetation Management Program.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and I can help put some of the resources that Josh is discussing. I'll put it in some type of review email as well, Carol.
Okay. Great.
All right. Is there anybody else that that I skipped on the chat that would like to speak and bring their questions up? We're all good? Okay. Great. Yeah, I will also add that something Brendan mentioned at the end of the chat is that I do believe CAL FIRE is pro fire. They're just looking out for safety. So it is during permit season, May 1st. After May 1st, we get into permit season. And so you just have to check with your local unit. And sometimes that's difficult, but necessary. And so, oh, go ahead, Josh.
The trend for CAL FIRE coming from a state level down is the encouragement of more and more acres burned in California. So I wouldn't say they're mandated exactly, but they have target levels that they want to do this. So you're not going to run into a scenario where they're going to say absolutely not. They're more than likely going to try to figure out how to make it work.
So is
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
is that where you start with the process then, CAL FIRE?
Yeah,
or you have to get your plan together first, right?
Yeah, but there's two contacts, and you would chat with them first before the fire. One, the first contact is that you have to get a permit through the air board in your air pollution in each county. The fees vary depending on what county you're in. Here in Tehama County, it's very low, but I've heard that's not the case in others. And after you obtain that, then you would go to CAL FIRE and actually meet with them, tell them what your plan is, and then set up an appointment date prior to the burn where they'll actually come out and inspect. This is all if you were doing it on your own. They'll come out and inspect that you have the right fire lines, wet areas, ability to control it if something happens, and go through all that. So even if you do it on your own, you would be able to garnish their expertise.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, Josh, I have another question. Thanks for the talk, first off. It's great to have the rangeland manager perspective. I'm wondering if you've ever done control for orchard grass. We have a lot of it up in the county in meadows and also in sparse woodlands. And it usually grows with like residual rushes and sedges, which should come back well, but also with perennial grasses, which would also come back well, but I just don't know how to control it.
I usually graze it out. I have a hard time keeping orchard grass in on fields. I got to watch my grazing management or else I'll wipe it out because all stored energy is above ground rather than below like a tall fescue. So I have not actually ever tried to control orchard grass. I've tried to plant it a lot, not been as successful as I wanted. I don't know that the fire would just because of the perennial nature of it. I don't think that generally, unless it was a brush fire that got really hot, that it would control it. In fact, if I was trying to encourage a dryland planting of it, I probably would burn a site to actually control annuals and not control it. But pretty easy to control with a cow.
Thanks.
Hi, this is Chrissy. I'd love to ask a question.
Sure.
We live in a couple of people have asked questions about controlling invasives in habitats that are basically woodland, which is more, a fairly common habitat up here. And I, for instance, have an area small by your standards, like you can't even, like a half an acre of area that I want to control that has native grasses, then lots of invasives, some grasses, some non-grasses that have come in between. Do you have, will you be able to include resources on controlling invasives in other than rangeland habitats, and also in controlling other kinds of grasses, invasive grasses?
The June burn strategy will work really well at almost all annual grasses. And it'll actually even encourage the perennials because you'll have a nutrient release as well. So it's probably the #1 method that sustained the perennial grasses that we're here in native times. And I'm sure you would see the same scenario. I would be very cautious in a wooded area on doing it. I know in my work with CAL FIRE here in the areas that we've targeted, we haven't completely written out blue oak woodlands, but we've tried to go where they were a tad more sparse.
Yeah.
There is other work going on, research right now, where they're looking at getting rid of other recruitment of other trees and encouraging oaks through fire. But that's not been my specialty. That's been more of Lanya, Quinn Davidson, and Jeff Stackhouse over on the coast.
Thank you. It's been very inspiring. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question too about Scotch broom. Do you have any timing tips? I'm working on a place. I'm trying to restore a grassland that's been completely overtaken by Scotch broom, and every time it gets pulled out, there's many more little seeds that come out, and it just keeps going. Do you have any suggestions?
I have only done herbicide control of Scotch broom. I don't know that I can look it up, but I don't. And in fact, I got a book right there that probably covers it. But I can't speak off of my own research on burning for Scotch broom. I don't really have it in my county, is why. In the 3 counties I work in mostly. Too bad my brother could tell you right off the top of his head, but I really only done some herbicide work on it and had great luck with triclopyr.
Okay, thank you.
Amber, it looks like Joanne Fights Kaufman had written in the chat that maybe she has some experience burning Scotch broom, and she says burn Scotch broom twice. Joanne, if you're still online and maybe want to chime in here, that'd be lovely. All right, no worries. Maybe I can look up some other resources on some of these other invasives that folks are. I'm asking.
Yeah, because that work has been done. It just hasn't been applicable to scenarios that I've run into. But I think that information's out there. We can definitely dig it up.
Yeah, definitely. And Josh, you work for the University of California Cooperative Extension, and I know you're up primarily in Tehama County, but the UC Extension is always a great resource, and so I encourage folks to reach out to some of the local offices around here and check out their website. There's tons of information out there.
Yeah, definitely your local farm advisor. If you've got Scotch broom, they've dealt with it.
Definitely. All right, well, we have 5 minutes left. If anybody has some last minute thoughts or questions, we can open it up. Otherwise, I might have us sign off. All right, Josh, thank you so much for such great information. If you could maybe share, if you feel comfortable sharing your presentation with me, that'd be great. I'll also plan to put together some of the resources you mentioned, but if you could send some of those my way, that would be great.
Yes, I can do that. I'll plan on sending you those and a copy of the presentation.
Thanks so much. All right, everybody. I hope you have a great night, and I look forward to seeing you at the next speaker series. It's March 9th. It's also the second Wednesday of the month. I'm hoping to see you there. All right. Have a good night.